The wake. The moon hung low over Lake Marshall, casting silver ripples across the water's surface. Four friends, Mike, Sarah, Danny, and Rachel, lounged on Mike's father's fishing boat, their laughter echoing across the empty lake. Rachel watched the water lap against the hull, trying to ignore the growing sense of wrongness that had been gnawing at her since sunset. Something about the way the lake seemed to swallow their reflections, how the depths seemed darker than they should be. "Did you guys hear about the disappearances?" Danny asked, cracking open another beer. His hands trembled slightly. He'd been on edge since finding those strange phosphorescent marks on the boat's hull earlier. 3 boats in the past month. They found them empty, just drifting, and the bodies that washed up later. He stopped, swallowing hard. Sarah grabbed his beer, taking a long swig. "Way to kill the mood, Danny. Besides, they said those bodies were from drowning." But her voice cracked on the last word. They all knew drowning victims didn't come ashore with those strange spiral-shaped wounds, their eyes replaced with pulsing bioluminescent growths. The first splash came from the stern, subtle enough that they thought it was just a fish. The second splash rocked the boat. Rachel grabbed the railing, her knuckles white. In the water below, something moved, something vast and wrong, its shape defying her mind's attempts to make sense of it. "Mike, maybe we should head back." "It's nothing," Mike said, but his voice wavered. "Probably just..." His face suddenly went slack, eyes widening as he stared past them into the water. A wet, gurgling sound escaped his throat. The creature struck without warning. A mass of sleek, dark flesh rose from the water, its skin like wet obsidian riddled with watching eyes. Multiple rows of bioluminescent spots pulsed along its length in hypnotic patterns that made Rachel's vision blur and her stomach heave. Mike didn't even have time to scream before it dragged him overboard, his body bending at impossible angles as tentacles coiled around his torso. Sarah lunged for him, but Danny held her back. The water churned red where Mike had disappeared. Rachel could see him still moving under the surface, mouth open in a silent scream as the creature's luminescent patches began to spread across his skin like a disease. Rachel scrambled for the radio, but only static answered her calls, static that somehow formed whispers, words in a language that made her ears bleed. Danny started laughing, a high, broken sound. He pointed at the water where dozens of glowing eyes now watched them from the depths. The boat rocked again, harder this time. Danny lost his balance, tumbling over the side, his scream cut short as something pulled him under. They heard his bones crack, watched his body contort as multiple limbs wrapped around him, each one covered in those pulsing geometric patterns that seemed to burn themselves into Rachel's retinas. Sarah and Rachel huddled in the center of the boat, back to back, watching the water. Rachel could feel Sarah's heart hammering through her spine, could smell the copper tang of blood from where Sarah had bitten through her own lip. "The keys," Sarah whispered, her voice raw. "We need to..." The creature burst from the water, its massive form arcing over the boat. In the moonlight, Rachel saw it clearly, a writhing mass of flesh and eyes and geometric patterns that shouldn't exist in nature. Parts of it seemed to fold into dimensions that her mind couldn't process. Embedded in its translucent tissue, she could see Mike and Danny's faces, their eyes now replaced with pulsing lights, their mouths moving in silent screams. Sarah shoved her toward the cabin, but the creature was faster, its tentacle wrapped around Sarah's waist, barbed suckers tearing through her clothes and into her flesh. Rachel watched in horror as the creature's bioluminescent patterns began spreading across Sarah's skin like infected veins. Sarah's last words turned into a wet gurgle as she was yanked into the darkness below. Rachel locked herself in the cabin, hands shaking as she tried to start the engine. Outside, she could hear something sliding across the deck, searching, a sound like wet meat slapping against the windows. The creature's lates pulsed in patterns that made her reality waver, and she could feel it trying to reach into her mind, showing her visions of the vast, dark spaces between stars where things like it waited and watched. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. Through the windshield, she saw Mike's face pressed against the glass, his eyes now glowing portals that revealed the thing's true form in the depths of their darkness. His mouth moved, forming words she was grateful she couldn't hear. She didn't look back as she throttled toward shore, didn't look at the pieces of her friends floating in the wake behind her, didn't stop until the boat crashed onto the beach, the hull scraped raw by the rocks and marked with those strange glowing patterns that seemed to pulse in sync with her heartbeat. They found her the next morning, still gripping the wheel, her hair turned white. The doctor said she'd suffered a psychotic break, but they couldn't explain the geometric patterns that had begun to spread across her skin, or why her eyes sometimes seemed to glow in the dark. They never found her friends, but on still nights, when the moon hangs low over Lake Marshall, people say they can see lights moving in the deep water, and sometimes they hear voices calling from beneath the surface, begging their loved ones to join them in the dark. Rachel knows better. She stays locked in her room now, covering all the mirrors and windows, because sometimes when she looks at her reflection, she sees those patterns spreading beneath her skin, and she knows that a part of the creature is still inside her, growing, waiting, watching through her eyes. And in her dreams, she sees her friends swimming in the deep, their bodies transformed into something beautiful and terrible, and they're always calling her home.